Hello everybody, today I am taking what is almost certain to be the last drive I'll ever have in a new Audi R8 press car, because this year the model is finally being discontinued. It was introduced 17 years ago now, back in 2006, with this Mark II arriving 8 years ago, back in 2015. But there is to be no third generation R8. This is it. So I figured it would be a great time to take a little stroll down memory lane and discuss why it is that the R8 managed in that time to morph from a car that I had little to no interest in to one that actually I've really got quite a soft spot for. When the R8 landed back in 2006, I was 17, and at an age where reality was beginning to bite. Had it come, I suppose, a few years earlier, maybe I would have been far more excited about it. But the fact was, as a 17-year-old, you are suddenly beginning to learn that things like Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Porsches, and Audi R8s are going to be a very, very long way away. At that time, I was delighted to be able to drive around in my dad's Mitsubishi L200 Warrior and my grandmother's Vauxhall Astra van. Many people, I'm sure, will have fond memories of the R8's first appearance on season 10 of Top Gear, which came in autumn of 2007. If memory serves, they pitted the car against the then current 911, the 997 generation, and although the 997 was argued to be the better handling car and quicker on track, it was still the R8 that you'd actually want, and I'm pretty sure the car that Clarkson wanted. As far as I was concerned, the R8 really was a little bit of a non-event. At that point in time, I would have been the sort of person saying it was really no better than a well-stocked TT. I also felt like the styling was a little bit too bland, and though the outside has really grown on me, the interior to this day remains, as far as I'm concerned, a little bit underwhelming for the money being asked. And at that age, £80,000 was so far away, it may as well have been £800,000. And the truth was, if you were going to have a dream car, you may as well have dreamed big. And so I continued lusting after the likes of Ferraris, Lamborghini Diablos, and so on and so forth. My mother and sister felt very differently though. They always lusted after an R8, in white with black wheels, and I'm sure they wouldn't have even been bothered about the interior. I'm not exactly sure why it was that they lusted after the car. Bear in mind, at that point, Iron Man had not come out, and honestly, certainly for my mother, I don't think that really would have made a blind bit of difference. However, I do think it was the favourite of a few footballers, and that likely had a little bit more to do with it. In any case, my first actual experience of the R8 came only a few years later, in around about 2010 or 2011. I was working for a small Porsche dealer, and at that time I was trying to convince my mother to spend a little bit of her money on something nice. The R8 had already depreciated a fair bit by then, and they had an example in that I think was selling for around £45,000. Humorously, they also had at the same time a couple of 996 GT3s. They were 35 grand, and nobody was interested. As Mum already had a couple of cars and the value of those was roughly equal to what the R8 was going to be, I was hoping I could persuade her into maybe buying it. So somehow, and to this day I don't really know how, I managed to convince the boss of the place to let me borrow the car and drive it the sort of 100-mile round trip to go and see my mum, let her have a go in it, and then take it back home, hoping I'd convinced her to buy it. She had a look at it, realised it was far too wide for her garage, and that the boot up the front was way too small for practical duties, and so said, "This is very, very lovely, but I don't think I can have one." That was a shame. I did manage to take my sister out in it, who got up to about 30 miles an hour and then started screaming. I also went round a roundabout with her in it, and not being silly, did manage to get to the tyres screeching, and she wasn't very impressed with me for that. And to this day, she thinks I was being an absolute loon, but I assure all of you, and her if she's watching, that no, I wasn't. I don't know what was going on there. But anyway, I was also myself a little bit disappointed with the car. You see, up until that point, I'd only really had experience of one supercar, and that was the Ferrari F355. By this point, the 355 was already getting on a bit, having gone out of production about 12 years earlier, so I was expecting the R8 to really kind of move the game on a bit, but It didn't feel masses faster, it probably is, and most of all, even then, I knew what good steering was. Probably helped that I was working for a Porsche dealer specialising in old air-cooled stuff, and the R8's helm was just underwhelming, just bland. Wind the clock on a few years and I'd started a YouTube channel. We're now talking around 2018, 2019. I'd been going for a couple of years and though numbers were going up, they were still overall fairly small. I had my Lotus Evora 400 and in the early days of the channel, a lot of the content I was producing was essentially comparisons between that and other sort of similarly or not so similarly priced cars. Mercedes-Benz C63 AMG, Jaguar F-Type, etc, etc. If you don't mind, this is a lovely bit of road, I appear to have it clear, and I expect you probably fancy a bit of a break from me making some noise, so I'll let the car take over for a bit. Where was I? Oh yes, cars that I was comparing with the Evora, and actually I have skipped a little bit too far ahead in the story. I need to rewind it back to late 2015, early 2016, when I had decided that I was going to buy a nice car and I was in the process of deciding to start a YouTube channel. I was trying to work out what to buy. The Evora was definitely up there on the list, as was the likes of a Ferrari 360 or an F430 and a Lamborghini Gallardo. But all of the Italian stuff was ruled out pretty quickly because though I could have afforded to have bought one back then, I knew that I wasn't really going to be earning much money for the next few years. So I decided the sensible thing to do would be to buy a car that was a little less maintenance intensive. The Evora was going to cost me the thick end of £70,000, and by then not only could I have bought an R8 V8, I could have also bought an R8 V10. So that then got me thinking that this could be a car that I might be able to run on a relatively modest budget. I went and drove a couple, including a V10 R-Tronic, which actually had a gearbox that I didn't hate anywhere near as much as I thought I would, and also I drove another V8 and I think another V10 as well. The one I wanted specifically was going to be a V10 manual in Sepang blue with the wingback bucket seats, which are easily some of my favourite seats in any car, full stop. I'm not sure that exact car ever appeared. I found ones that were close. There was one that had all the options, everything, all the carbon, the nice seats, all that stuff, but was R-Tronic. And then I found others that were in the right colour, manual and all that, but didn't have the correct seats. So I was struggling to find the car that I wanted, and a few test drives of it just left me thinking, you know what, it's a really, really good car, but there were a couple of perhaps surprising things getting in the way. First off, the boot. Combined with that and the lack of back seats next to an Evora, the R8 was actually the less practical car. I also figured, particularly in V10 guys, it was going to drink quite a bit more too, and being an older car was either not going to come with a warranty or one that wasn't going to be anywhere near as robust as the factory one I would have been getting with Lotus. Finally, once I happened upon the idea of YouTube as a career, I also figured that actually the R8 had been kind of done to death. At that point in time, Paul Wallace getting his V8 R8 was still a fairly recent memory, and that I think was some real proper good YouTube content from him. And so with the R8 being so well known, I thought, you know what? It's not going to be the right car. From a business perspective, it's just the wrong decision to make. So back then to 2018, give or take, and things were going okay. I had got an invite to an event called SMMT, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, which is a big organisation that does all sorts of statistics and various things relating to the motor trade, and they host an event at Millbrook, the Proving Ground, which if you haven't heard of it is fairly well known in the industry, and you've almost likely seen it because that is where the DBS got rolled in Casino Royale. Pretty cool place actually, and you've seen it also in millions of old Top Gear tests and everything. If you recall, as I do, Tiff Needell leaping a 993, I think turbo, that was on the mountain course at Millbrook. Anyway, the idea of such a day is that a whole bunch of manufacturers will be there with a variety of different cars. There's probably 100 in all, and you just turn up, say, can I have a go in this car? You take it off for 20 minutes, and that's a good way to get a rough feel for it, and also to meet some people. I'd been speaking to Audi at this point, trying to butter them up to give me an R8, and they said, yeah, sure, come out. By then, the Mark II was the car that was out, this shape essentially, and they said, yeah, all right, come to SMMT, you can take an R8 out briefly, and essentially, we'll see how we get on, and then we'll go from there. So I took out an R8, a Spyder, very similar in fact to this one, and if you'd like to know my opinion on this car from a sort of journalistic perspective, see my review. I have already filmed that this week, and by the time this video's out, it should be too. So I'll put a link to that down below. Anyway, I got on very well, liked the car, although, let me confess to something. I did nearly crash that day. Not in the R8, I also took out an RS4, the then new one with the turbo V6. I'd taken it out, driven it a little bit, was somewhat underwhelmed. Then I sort of parked it back up at the Audi stand, and I thought, this car doesn't sound that great. Maybe it sounds better if I just rev it a little bit at idle. I put it in park, or what I thought was park, and when I put my foot down, it sort of shot back by a couple of feet, and I managed to catch it real quick. It wasn't park, it was the parking brake. There were two things that said P nearly on top of each other, which I maintain is a poor design, but yeah, nearly ended my relationship with Audi before it had even begun. So, that day had gone well. I then messaged them and said, hey guys, can I have that R8 press car that we were talking about? And they said, well, no. You can have an R8 at some point, but we don't give anybody an R8 as their first press car. So I said, okay, that's fine. They said, would you like an RS3? And I thought, oh, you know what? I love an RS3. It's got that 5-cylinder engine, and at the time, might have been the first 5-cylinder car I actually drove. So I did a couple of videos with it, and both of them did pretty well for me, certainly above average numbers for the time. So after that, I then said, hey guys, can I have that R8 now, please? And they said, well, unfortunately, no. You see, we've just facelifted it. And because all the cars we currently have are the pre-facelift, we don't really want journalists doing reviews of cars that you can't technically buy new, which is fair and normal policy for most manufacturers that I know. They said you will get an R8, but it'll have to be the new one, and because everybody else also wants to go and you are small fry, you'll be at the bottom of the list, which was absolutely fine, and I respect that, and I was small fry and still am really, so I had no problem with that. I said, okay, that's cool. Have you got an A2? I think they were a little bit surprised by that, because up until that point, all I've been pestering them for was the R8. But the A2 was also a car that I felt was really, really cool, had the same sort of depth of engineering as something like this, and it was also a car that I felt was just completely underrated. They came back and said, yeah, actually, we do have a couple of A2s in the heritage fleet. We've got the regular one, and we've got an example of the A2 3L. That's the super efficient one that only does 3 litres per 100 kilometres, essentially 100 mpg, and I was surprised they had that, because I don't think it ever officially sold here, and typically manufacturers won't have stuff in their heritage fleet that they didn't sell in the market of, you know, wherever they are. But Audi had this, so they said, yeah, we'll introduce you to some guys at the heritage fleet. It was at this point that I met a lovely chap called Alex, who was instrumental in much of what came next. They brought out the A2, they brought out the A2 3L. I went there with a good friend of mine, Darren, who had the RS4 that you may have seen on the channel before, the Sprint Blue B7, and we did the A2 and A2 3L video, and it went nuts. Did something like 250,000 views really, really quickly. Now that may be because quite a few people mistook the 3L not for meaning 3 litres per 100 kilometres, but a 3-litre engine. Many people commented saying, I thought this was a 3-litre A2 and such like, and I mean, I never intended to mislead anybody, but hey, it was a happy accident, and I got a lot of views. As a result of that, Audi were very happy and said to me that the heritage fleet was essentially open to me, and I could basically have most of what I wanted out of it. So I said, cool, that's great. What's in it? The heritage fleet, by the way, is kept in a very secure facility that nobody knows where it is, and nobody ever goes in there unless you work for Audi. So I said, yeah, cool, okay, tell me what you've got and I'll pick from the list. And they said, well, we can't really tell you what we have, but you can guess, and if we've got it, we'll say yes or no. Okay, fine. At this point, there was really only one other car that I thought about, which was the RS2. So I said, could I have an RS2? And they said, yeah, not a problem. And I then said, what other stuff have you got? And they said, oh, well, we've got the A1 Quattro concept. That was really, really cool. And I said, okay, I thought, let's play them at their own game. I said, well, what have you got in the fleet that you would like to see a feature done on? They said, we've got a Q7. So, a Q7, oh, come on. It's the V12 diesel, they said. Ooh, that's cool. The RS2, it turned out, they initially said had to be chaperoned because it was, I think, one of their original press cars from the mid-1990s and had, when I sat in it, less than 3,500 miles. To drive that was a very, very special experience, and I am honoured that Audi trusted me with something like that. Happily, these videos also did quite well. The Q7 actually, in particular, another big hit, and Audi were very, very happy with this. So then, in 2019, at long last, I got that R8 press car that I've been asking for. It was a V10 performance, the facelifted, top-of-the-line version with the Quattro all-wheel drive system, and I hatched a bit of a plan. I knew I'd have the car for a week, and back then, the channel wasn't quite so intense and full-time as it is now. I'd been chatting to my friend James Dean, and he'd mentioned that he'd never ever been to Scotland. People kept asking me to do road trip content, so I figured, why not get two birds with one stone and take the R8 up to Scotland, make a bit of a film with it. So I messaged Audi and said, can I take it to Scotland? Do you mind? And they said, yeah, go for it. And I did. We took it up there. We did struggle a little bit to get stuff in it, but packed the car we did essentially sort of half of the NC500 and had a marvellous time. And that, I think, was another sort of formative moment in my YouTube career, because there were a couple of points where we parked the R8 up this glistening yellow thing, same shade as this, Vegas yellow, and I'm a sucker for yellow cars, and it just glowed. And I was sat there looking at this thing being like, that is a magazine front cover. That looks absolutely sensational. And I was very happy about this. Not long after, courtesy of the good people at Audi's Heritage Fleet, I decided to carry on this R8 loving by then driving a couple of examples of the first generation car, the R8 GT Spyder, which will feature again in a little bit, and the oft-forgotten R8 LMX, the swan song for the first generation car. Both fantastic things, and again, both incredible experiences. The GT, though, was the one that for me was just a little bit more special than anything else I'd experienced. I then also got to drive a first generation V10 once again, and I started to think that maybe I'd sold the car short. On my early experience, I was just misremembering, because I thought it was a horrid car with awful steering that just didn't have the precision you'd expect from a supercar, and was essentially the thing that all people tell you all Audis are: understeery and miserable to drive. But this V10, though, was nothing of the sort. The engine was amazing, and all the V10s are, but the steering is what really took me by surprise. It had feel, it had texture, it had keenness. It was so much better than my memory told me an early R8 was. But as it happened, fate not long after told me that I wasn't maybe as stupid as I had thought, because I managed to get a drive of the R8. The one, I think, certainly for British petrol heads, that is maybe more famous and more influential than any other. And that is the Daytona grey car that Clarkson drove on that episode of Top Gear way back in 2007. I then got to spend a few days with it, and other than the fact it was like having a genuine celebrity on the driveway, I was flabbergasted, because though the engine was decent, maybe better than I recalled, and the gearbox still sensational, the looks maybe even better than they'd ever been, the steering was still pants. Just atrocious, lifeless, lacking in feel and everything else. I later found out from Ricky Elder of RE Performance and R8 Gallardo and Huracan Guru that when the V10 came out, they essentially changed the design of the suspension to match that used by the Gallardo, and that setup was entirely different to what the early V8s had been using. All the V10s have this particular setup, and later V8s do. Very problematic if you do happen to buy an early R8 and it has issues with its suspension, because you can't buy many of the parts. You have to get essentially an entire new setup, which will cost you about 6,000 quid. At the same time, I also had another R8 on the driveway, this time an example of the R8 rear-wheel drive coupe. And that was the first time I ever had a long-term press car. Unfortunately, it also happened to arrive right as we walked into another lockdown, so I had a whole bunch of all sorts of interesting and exciting content planned, which all wound up getting binned because essentially I couldn't do nearly anything of it. Fortunately, a few of my YouTube friends stepped in and helped out. We did manage to get some stuff made regardless, but it was frustrating. In fact, I even had at one point 3 R8s on the driveway. The original V8, the ex-Top Gear press car, then the rear-wheel drive coupe I just mentioned, and my good friend Anthony's R8 GT Spyder, his first supercar, and something that I'm very, very happy to say he still owns, not just because it's a fantastic car and he's become an amazing friend, but because it was just another moment for both of us. I think joining him for getting his first supercar was amazing. I made a video on that. If you want to see it, I'll put it in the list down below of all the other videos I've mentioned today, and if you haven't seen any of them, good luck to you. There's going to be a lot of content to work your way through, but that was a very emotional purchase, and if you want to know why it was such an emotional purchase for him, please check out the video. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it. That car has appeared on the channel a number of times now and remains, I think, my favourite of all the R8s. There is just something very, very special about the first gen GT. And this is probably about the right time to mention the fact that I also did do a video with the car that gave the R8 its name, the Le Mans race car. I think there's probably a whole generation of people out there who've grown up now not realising the R8 name was attached to something else that didn't have number plates. One winter I was dealing with Audi, and by this point I had a really good relationship with them, and as we couldn't really do too much content, particularly with the heritage fleet over winter time, I said, would it be possible to get a race car or two out, because I know you've got some, and make essentially some static content, giving people a close-up look that they will have never ever had before with this kind of thing? And they said, yeah, sure. So we had a replica of an old Audi sort of race car from the 70s or 80s. We had an Audi Super Tourer, that was really cool, an R10 or 12, I can't recall which, but a show car, and a real legitimate ex-Le Mans R8, which was only, I think, an ECU away from being able to run. That was cool. Seeing these things in the flesh is always an amazing experience. But with this one, I kind of looked at it and I thought, well, you know, we're here and, you know, we're in the proper place and we are the proper people. Could we take the covers off? So we did. We lifted the covers off, we had a good look, and it was amazing. I mean, underneath, they're like a single-seater. This thing is an incredible piece of technology, and getting your hands on a race car like that, I mean, that is, well, I was about to say something wildly inappropriate and terribly un-PC, but it's, like getting your hands on one of your favourite pop stars, put it that way. Anyway, that was a great experience, and afterwards I had another press car or two, and then it seemed that the R8 had reached the end of the road. But for this one, I wanted to do something different. Every time I'd got a press car, I'd ask for a coupe, because I think they look better and they got a bit more storage space. But up in Scotland, I got to drive a Spyder, owned by a chap called John, a V10. And though I've always known that the R8 Spyder is a very compromised thing, it's very, very heavy compared to the coupe, and therefore is going to suffer. And I don't even like folding soft tops. I'd much prefer a hard top, and for this sort of money I felt like you should get one of those. But anyway, the issue was, every time I went and got a coupe, I realised I made a terrible mistake, because though they are the slightly more practical car, they're also kind of claustrophobic, kind of cramped. And especially if you're going to go and do something like a nice big trip around the Highlands of Scotland, you want to be able to appreciate the scenery. And in the coupe, you just can't. I mean, the roof will be here. So, I decided that for the last trip out in the R8, I would ask for a Spyder, and happily they had one in my favourite colour. Unfortunately, it's been a rubbish week this week. Not for the weather or anything else, and not professionally, it's been absolutely fantastic, but personally, I've had one of the worst weeks of my entire life. And I'm not going to bore you with the details because you don't need to know. I'm fine, thank you for asking, and I'm sure many people will. But anyway, I've done a lot of miles in this car, going to places that nobody really ever wants to go to. And it has been really, really nice to have something to hand that you can just open the door, plug your phone into, get your Android Auto, everything works, parking sensors, cameras, stereo, Bluetooth, all that sort of stuff. But that's also fun, that also puts a smile on your face, that also distracts you from more serious things, gets people talking, gets conversations started, and has been a really, really much needed and helpful companion. So, though the R8 will never ever be a perfect car, and if you disbelieve me, check out my review, I'm pretty honest with these things, it is one that for very, very many reasons has worked its way very much into my art, as have a great number of other Audis. I've now driven a Quattro. I got to drive up the hill at Goodwood. The one and only time I've been to the Festival of Speed was the year when nobody else went, and I got invited as a guest of Audi. We convinced them to let my friend Darren bring his RS4, which was a member of the press fleet for the day, and I know meant a lot to him. And I was driving an RS7 following Stig Blomqvist up the Goodwood Hill, who was piloting one of his old Group B Quattros. Now that was special. I'm always grateful to Audi for that, and for the fact that even when I have slated their products, they've been very fair and understanding. I know a lot of people think that journalists only ever say nice things about cars in fear of not getting another one. No, I've always said exactly what I have thought, and Audi, fair play to them, have never held that against me, which is nice. So while that may be the end of new R8 content on the channel, there are still plenty of them out there to drive, and if you have one that you think I do need to sample, please do get in touch, because I'm looking forward to seeing a whole lot more of the R8 over the next few years, and indeed many other Audis too. So, if you've got to the end, I want to say a huge thanks to you, as ever, for watching, and don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.